Hello and welcome, this is Cavalier Astoria, and today I'm going to be talking about the M1 Carbine. The M1 Carbine came to be because the US military needed a replacement for the M1911 pistol. You see, prior to World War II, it was common only for the infantry rifles to be issued to combat arms, rather than the various support arms of the military. Combat arms are the soldiers who are expected to do most of the fighting. Back during World War I, this was primarily the infantry and the cavalry. What this meant is that if you weren't an infantryman or a cavalryman, you would receive a pistol rather than a rifle. This included, but is not limited to, engineers, drivers, administrative staff, and artillerymen. What is also interesting is that even in the combat arms, you were not guaranteed a rifle. If you're in a machine gun squad, you didn't get a rifle. If you're an officer, you did not receive a rifle. Radio men and medics were also left out. This was because most militaries, not just the US military, had the attitude of soldiers whose primary job wasn't shooting the enemy with a rifle wouldn't get a rifle. It would just be unnecessary weight most of the time, and so why would you even spend the money? The prevailing attitude was that soldiers should instead focus on their primary job. This is mostly due to the fact that equipping all soldiers with rifles was expensive, and supplying enough ammunition even more so. And that's not even mentioning that oftentimes weapons supplied to non-combat troops would never get used in combat. So most countries kind of said, well, what's the point of supplying the whole army with rifles if they aren't going to be used? This attitude actually lasted for a long time in military circles. Then World War I happened, and like most countries, the US learned a lot of lessons from this war. Mainly the fact that their attitudes towards who gets a rifle versus who doesn't was out of date. For the first time, a lot of soldiers who previously would rarely fight found themselves caught up in engagements far more often. Before, the pistols were mainly meant to protect the user and buy them enough time to escape from the enemy. But now soldiers were having to use them far more often, as now forces were better at breaching enemy lines and attacking into rear areas. German infiltration tactics and the arrival of the tank into warfare meant that troops behind the lines suddenly needed better weapons. Also, machine gun teams, radio men, officers, and other frontline soldiers now couldn't rely on the riflemen to protect them, and increasingly found themselves needing rifles for themselves. In order to help solve this, the M1 Garand, when it was adopted, was initially supposed to be handed out to everyone. But problems would arise. You see, the M1 Garand was the best rifle of World War II. However, the rifle weighs about 9.5 pounds, and as I said before, a lot of these soldiers had other duties they had to fulfill. For example, machine gun crews and motor crews had to carry not only their own personal weapons and gear, but all the ammo and gear necessary for operating the heavier weapons, such as tripods and that stuff. So lugging around a heavy rifle with heavy ammunition was not ideal for them. Engineers also had a problem as well, as they would also have to frequently carry bridging equipment and explosives, meaning that a heavier rifle was not ideal. These concerns would lead to the Chief of the Infantry in the US Army to request a new carbine in 1938 in order to meet these requirements. The requirements that the Army would put out for this new weapon would be it could not exceed 5 pounds, had to be effective up to 300 yards, be in select fire, be chambered in .30 carbine, and must have detachable box magazines. Now, the select fire requirement is actually very interesting. It was dropped after the first trial after none of the companies involved could both make the new carbine under 5 pounds and select fire. Thus, that requirement was just dropped to being just semi-automatic. But if the US decided to keep this requirement paired with the .30 caliber carbine, which is an intermediate cartridge, it would have made the M1 Carbine the first ever assault rifle in the world, beating out the STG-44 and its MKB-42 prototype versions. Now, this would be an interesting alternate history scenario of the US military actually keeping the M1 Carbine's select fire capability, but unfortunately, the M1 Carbine was meant more for a second line rifle, so the weight requirement was a far more important requirement. After the first round of testing in spring of 1941, a second round would be held in fall of the same year. This time, Winchester would win the competition, and the M1 Carbine we know was adopted. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and Germany would declare war a few days later. Keep in mind the M1 Carbine was only adopted in fall of 1941, a mere few months before Pearl Harbor happened. The M1 Carbine was not ready to be produced until 1942. Despite this late entry into the war, the M1 Carbine would become the most produced U.S. weapon in World War II. 6.1 million carbines were produced, compared to both the M1 Grand's 5.4 million and the M1 Thompson, which had 1.3 million produced. It would soon become widely popular amongst the soldiers for both its lightweight and ease of use. The M1 Carbine would continue to be used by the military well into the Cold War, until about 1973. It would receive 3 upgrades as time went on. The first big one was the M1A1, which is the paratrooper variant with the folding stock. The M2 Carbine was made to be select fire and now had a 30-round magazines. Basically, it was what the M1 Carbine originally was supposed to be until they removed the select fire requirement. And lastly, the M3 Carbine, which was just the M2 Carbine, but with a mount for an infrared scope. Anyway, that was a quick guide made for the M1 Carbine of World War II. Thank you for watching, and this was Cavalier Historia, and goodbye.